When you're standing in a damp basement or watching a small wastewater line back up, the first thought is usually, I need a pump, but the second thought is whether that pump will actually move the water without turning your whole system into a headache. I've spent the last couple of days looking at what a submersible effluent pump actually does in a typical home or light commercial setting, reading the few reviews that exist, and matching those insights against the specs you'll see on the product page. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. The Goulds WE0311M is marketed as a 1/3 horsepower, single-phase unit that runs on standard 115V power and pulls up to 10.7 amps. On paper that sounds like a solid middle ground, big enough to handle a residential sewage line, small enough that you won't need a dedicated circuit. The real question is whether those numbers translate into reliable, everyday performance when you actually drop it into a pit, hook it up, and let it run. First, let's talk about the kind of job this pump is built for. An effluent pump is designed to move water that contains solids. Think of the kind of slurry you get from a basement floor drain, a small lift station, or a garden pond with fish waste. It's not a clean water sump pump, it's meant to tolerate a bit of grit and debris. That means the impeller and housing are typically more robust, with clearances that let particles pass without jamming. In practice, that makes a difference when you have a basement that occasionally fills with rainwater that has picked up dirt, leaves, or even a few small toys. A regular sump pump would chew through that, but an effluent pump like this one is less likely to seize up. Installation is where a lot of buyers trip up, especially if they've never dealt with a submersible unit before. The WE0311M comes as a single piece with a built-in float switch, so you don't have to wire a separate on-off sensor. You just lower it into the pit, connect the power cord to a GFC protected outlet, and let the float do the work. That simplicity is a strength. There's no separate controller to install, and the wiring is standard 115V. However, the single-phase design does mean you need a reliable 120V circuit that can handle the 10.7 amp draw. In a typical residential setup that isn't a problem, but if you're trying to run it off a shared circuit that already powers lights or a dehumidifier, you could see the breaker trip during a peak discharge. One practical trade-off is the pump's capacity versus its power draw. At 1/3 HP, the Goulds can move roughly 2,000 gallons per hour under ideal conditions, enough to clear a flooded basement in a few hours, assuming the water isn't too deep. In real life, the flow rate drops once the inlet gets clogged with solids or the head height increases. Users who have a pit that sits 1,012 feet below the discharge point might notice the pump struggling more than they expected. The key here is to keep the intake as clear as possible. A simple mesh screen on the inlet can catch larger debris, and a routine cleaning schedule will prevent the impeller from getting gummed up with sludge. That maintenance requirement is a weakness you need to plan for. You can't just set it and forget it like a basic sump pump. Another point that comes up when you compare this model to a standard sump pump is noise. Because it's moving heavier, grit-laden water, the motor has to work a bit harder, and you'll hear a low hum that's louder than a typical clean water pump. In a finished basement that's used as a living space, that hum can be noticeable, especially at night when everything else is quiet. If you need a whisper-quiet solution, this might not be the best fit. Conversely, for a utility room or an outdoor pump house, the sound level is usually acceptable. Durability is where Goulds tends to earn its reputation. The pump's housing is cast iron with a corrosion-resistant coating, which holds up well in the mildly acidic environment you get from household wastewater. The motor is sealed, meaning you won't have to worry about water leaking into the windings as long as you don't exceed the rated depth, about 6 feet of submersion according to the manual. Over the course of the 16 Amazon ratings, the average score sits at 4.1 stars. While we don't have detailed comments to dissect, a rating that high on a niche product suggests most owners find it does what they need without major surprises. It also hints that the occasional negative experience likely related to installation mistakes or misuse doesn't dominate the consensus. Who should consider buying the Goulds WE0311M? If you're a homeowner with a small to medium-sized basement that occasionally backs up, especially one that drains into a pit that also collects gray water or garden runoff, this pump hits a sweet spot. It's also a solid choice for a light commercial setting. Think a small workshop with a floor drain that sometimes sees